How's it going, guys? Today we're going to do a brief crash course on supply. Now, unlike the demand video, the supply video is going to be a single video because pretty much all of the rules that we learned in the first of the two demand videos about movements and shifts and changes in quantity versus changes in the overall curve, all of those rules apply to supply as well, with the notable exception that supply shows the opposite relationship between price and quantity that demand did. So as we can see, the supply curve is upward sloping over here because of the law of supply, which just basically tells us that price and quantity supplied have a direct relationship along the supply curve, whereas they had an indirect or a negative relationship price and quantity demand showed on the demand curve. So save for the fact that the curves are complete opposites of each other, the basic rules remain the same. So, a leftward shift is still a decrease. A rightward shift is still an increase. The same things basically cause movements along the supply curve as cause movements along the demand curve. So pretty much all the rules we learned in the very first video are the same, with the exception that we're dealing with a positive relationship between price and quantity and not a negative one. So I'll always kind of rehash this at the beginning of the lesson, showing what a movement looks like, even though the crux of our lesson is really going to be shifts. Keeping in mind that the kids are told that its changes in price will cause a movement along the supply curve, but also its changes in demand. So since they already know what the demand curve looks like and should at this point know that there's actually a demand curve on this graph as well, you can always tell them anytime demand shifts, that's going to cause a movement along the supply curve. And you might want to draw it out for them. So here we go. I went ahead and drew that for them just to make sure that they can kind of visually wrap their head around the fact that changes in overall demand cause movements along the supply curve, and then also that changes in supply are going to cause movements along the demand curve as well. So the big thing that we need to focus on here is going to be the determinants of supply. We don't want to spend a whole lot of time going over the rules again, because they're basically the same rules from demand. There's one more determinant of supply than there is for demand that the kids need to know for the test. So there's 6 determinants of supply. We use the acronym TIGERS to help the kids remember that. So let's go over each of the components of TIGERS. I think that objectively speaking, these are actually a little easier to understand than the determinants of demand are. There's not as much complex stuff going on here. The big thing that I've noticed that trips up the students is that when you're talking about determinants of supply, they tend to have difficulty thinking like a producer. So you've got to remind them that when we're talking about supply, it's not about what they would do, but what about the producer or the seller of a product would do. And once they can put themselves into the producer's shoes and get that particular frame of mind, I think the determinants of supply are actually a little easier to understand than the determinants of demand are. So let's run through those. All right, so here's our determinants of supply. So the acronym we're aiming for here is going to be TIGERS. The first of the determinants of supply is going to be changes in productive technology. So not all changes in technology, but any change in technology that makes production either more or less efficient is going to affect the supply curve. Generally speaking, 9 times out of 10, we invent new technology that makes production more efficient. So most of the time, your changes in technology questions, the answer is going to be supply shifts to the right, as most of the time, new technology increases our productivity. So when we have better technology, we're going to have a rightward shift in the supply curve. In the event that we come up with a disruptive technology that actually makes us less productive, it doesn't happen often, but it does occur, you can have a leftward shift here. If the kids want an example, you can always use smartphones as your default example. Having a smartphone on us has made the average American worker a little less productive, as we spend between 5 and 10% of our time at work surfing the internet on our phones when we should be doing other things. So it's not often that a new technology actually makes us less productive, but the kids can probably relate to that one, especially the ones that have jobs. You can always ask them, how much of your time at work do you spend on your phone not working? And it's probably a greater than 0% amount of time. The second of our big determinants of supply is going to be changes in input prices. We'll probably need to define inputs for the kids. They're always going to tell you it's the thing that gets put into production. Although that's a simplification, yep, that's perfectly acceptable. Whatever gets them to remember it. So the key here is that it's the input prices that affect production costs. So kind of as a general rule, anything that changes the production cost of a product is going to affect the supply of that product. So if production costs go up and production becomes more expensive, producers can't afford to make as much, and you're going to have a leftward shift in the supply curve. If production costs go down for some reason and things become cheaper, you're going to see a rightward shift in the supply curve. One of the things that I'll like to point out here is if you ask the kids what the production inputs are for most products, the one they tend to leave out is the one most commonly tested on the AP exam. So you ask them, what are the inputs into socks? They'll be like cotton or elastic. They have to remember that labor costs are an input into the production of basically everything. And for most of our manufactured goods, labor cost is the single highest cost input. So the AP exam, when they ask input prices questions, like to ask questions about labor costs or wages or minimum wages. So make sure that the kids understand that wages are an input into production of basically everything, and that that's the single most common way this particular determinant is going to be tested. Next, we have G. The G in Tiger stands for government actions. Basically, there's a couple of different types of government actions or regulatory actions that can be taken here that's going to affect overall supply on a product. The most common ones to show up are going to be taxes and subsidies. The kids have a pretty good grasp on taxes. The one thing that you want to stress to them is that this is going to be a tax on production, not to be confused with the sales tax or an excise tax, which is a tax on consumption. So taxes on production make it cost more to produce products and therefore cause a leftward shift in the supply curve. If the government produces or gives a subsidy on production, this is going to cause a rightward shift on the supply curve. You will probably need to explain subsidies to the kids at this point, because although they understand the concept of taxes, subsidies in production is a little bit more complicated. I like to tell them it's a negative tax or it's the government paying you to do something. You can always use like solar panels or electric cars as an example of government subsidies here. If you would like, you can also talk about quotas at this point. You don't really have to, because the AP exam pretty much doesn't ask about quantity controls like quotas. But if you wanted to, you can certainly talk about government actions on quotas. That certainly would affect the supply of a product, although you don't have to here. It will likely not show up on the macro exam. Determinant number 4 is going to be future expectations, which is the same as one of the determinants of demand. This one doesn't have a set of rules with it. You kind of just have to let the kids walk it through logically. So give them a couple of different examples of things that might happen in the future, and then ask them if they were a producer, how they would react. I like to talk about, the production of chocolate bunnies in the months leading into Easter, or production of toys before Christmas. You can also ask them about future expectations when it comes to the cost of production. So if I foresee that labor costs are going to go up, maybe I produce more of my products today before those costs go up to help hedge against those additional losses. There's not a set of rules here, but they need to be able to walk through various scenarios and talk about how the expectation would affect the producer and how that would affect the amount they supply. Probably the most complicated of the determinants of supply for a couple of reasons is going to be changes in the price of related goods. Now, the first reason why this is complicated is because it sounds exactly like changes in the price of related goods when it came to demand, keeping in mind this is where we talked about complementary goods and substitute goods for demand. For supply, it's the same basic determinant, but the relationships between the products are completely different. So we're talking about related goods when it comes to supply. We're talking about what are called substitutes in production, or productive substitutes. These are essentially goods that use the same inputs. So your most common examples usually are like agricultural products. So if I have a field and I have fertilizer and I have water, I can grow corn in that field, I can grow soybeans on that field, I can grow wheat in that field. And so if you ask the kids, how do I decide which of those things I'm going to grow this year? The answer you're looking for from them is that you're going to grow whichever of those is most profitable. And so what we see happen for productive substitutes is if one of them goes up in price and becomes more profitable, people stop producing the other goods and move their production into that productive substitute. If they need another example of productive substitutes, I like to use the Taco Bell menu as an example. Ask the kids to make a list of the ingredients that go into things at Taco Bell. It's actually not a very long list. Most of the things on Taco Bell's menu are basically the same ingredients, reorganized into different shapes. So if you ask them, if the public is willing to pay more for tacos, what'll happen to the supply of taco salads? They can certainly probably relate with Taco Bell choosing to make fewer taco salads and more crispy tacos. if you want to give them maybe a little bit more silly of an example. So the general rule here is that production is going to shift to whatever product goes up in price. So if one of the productive substitutes is going up in price, supply of the other one is going to fall because people will stop producing the other product and produce the one that has a higher price. So given our corn versus wheat example, if the price of corn goes up, we would expect the supply of wheat to fall as farmers who were previously growing wheat give up on wheat and start growing corn instead. Last but not least, we have probably the easiest one to understand and the most obvious one, which is changes in the number of sellers in the marketplace. You could also say number of producers. I'm going to say sellers because it makes the word spell out tigers, and that's better than tiger P, I think. In this case, it's a really easy concept to understand. If more producers are making the same product, then supply of that product is going to go up. If less producers are making that product, then the supply of that product will go down. And you can give them, any number of examples where a producer goes out of business and supply of those products fell, or I like to use, at least lately, fidget spinners. All of a sudden, there's 50 different fidget spinner producers, and the supply of fidget spinners is up. But you can use really any example here of number of producers either entering into the marketplace, driving up supply, or leaving the marketplace and causing supply to fall, a leftward shift in supply. Hopefully this is helpful to you. Thank you very much, and I'll catch you all in the next video.